Cultural Heritage Act has introduced the Due Diligence Assessment process. Now, the Due Diligence Assessment process is to help a landowner or a proponent that wishes to undertake an activity on their land determine whether that activity is going to cause harm to Aboriginal cultural heritage. The process is designed so that you can determine whether there's Aboriginal cultural heritage on your land, determine whether your activities will affect that Aboriginal cultural heritage, whether it will harm Aboriginal cultural heritage, and it's also to determine, I suppose, what the next steps are. So if you are going to undertake an activity, who do you have to consult before you undertake that activity? So the due diligence assessment is based on activity tiers, which I've discussed in my previous video. So once you've established whether an activity you want to undertake falls into a tier 1, a tier 2 or tier 3, you then have to look to the new Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Act, the code and the other associated guidelines to determine what due diligence assessment process you need to take in order to receive authorisation to undertake that activity. And the purpose is to reduce harm to Aboriginal cultural heritage. So if you're a tier 1 activity, the due diligence process is pretty simple, it's pretty straightforward. So it's a question of referring to the Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Directory. Now, the directory is a place where they have all the information about existing Aboriginal cultural heritage, Aboriginal sites, protected areas within the state. It also has information about who the knowledge holders are, who the native title parties are within that area. So the first instance is to look online on this directory for your area of land where you want to undertake this activity and determine whether there is any cultural heritage on that property. The next step is to do a visual inspection. If you do a visual inspection, you can't see any sort of any objects, any landscape that would be of significance and therefore fall into the definition of Aboriginal cultural heritage, then you're free to progress. You have authorisation to progress with that activity. If you undertake a search or you have a search on the directory or a visual inspection and there is Aboriginal cultural heritage on the land, then it's a case of following up, so doing further information on the directory. So if a survey was undertaking, reviewing that survey, it's about contacting your local Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Service, knowledge holders, native title holders in the area that may be noted on the directory, and confirming whether your activity will cause any risk of harm to Aboriginal cultural heritage. Bit of a different story if we look at a tier 2 activity. So as I previously said, a tier 2 activity is moderate ground disturbance. So for agriculture, this can be, I suppose, controlling weeds and pests and sort of disturbing land, but no more than, 20 kilos of dirt is kind of taken from a certain area. No more than 100 metres squared is affected. So very minimal, moderate sort of ground disturbance. If this is sort of an activity, it could be, fencing or something like that you're wishing to undertake, the due diligence process is a little bit more involved. So again, it's a case of looking on the directory. Is there any Aboriginal cultural heritage on the property? If there isn't, then it's a case of going, okay, I need to take another step. I need to go, is there any reports done about Aboriginal cultural heritage? Has been any surveys done? Has anything else been done to determine whether there is or isn't Aboriginal cultural heritage? And from there, if there's no sign that Aboriginal cultural heritage has been discovered, no reports, no surveys, or the surveys have come back and said there's no Aboriginal cultural heritage on this piece of land, then you can proceed with the activity. But it's always advised in those circumstances to contact your local Aboriginal cultural heritage services and even the department as well if you're uncertain. The other side is if you do a search on the directory and it comes back and there is Aboriginal cultural heritage, the surveys say that, there has been cultural heritage in this area, or there is a chance that there is, it's a protected area or an Aboriginal site, then it's a case of making an application for a permit to undertake that activity. Now, the permits process is, I suppose, its own process entirely. There is a prescribed form under this new legislation, but essentially it's making an application to the minister to seek a permit. And there are timeframes and restraints about what you have to include in that permit. You can also, depending on the type of the activity, you may also have to develop an Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Management Plan, which would involve involvement from the local Aboriginal Cultural Heritage services, native title holders, any knowledge holders in the area that may be affected as well. So it's a bit more of a strenuous process, but ultimately if you're going for a tier 2 activity, then you're looking at a permit or an Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Management Plan to reduce the risk to Aboriginal cultural heritage. We then move on to tier 3 activities. And so the due diligence assessment for tier 3 activities, which as I previously said is, there's going to be high ground disturbance, more of a risk to Aboriginal harm. Then again, you start with the directory. You have a look on the directory and go, okay, is there Aboriginal cultural heritage on this piece of land, or is there surveys or reports that confirm or deny whether there's Aboriginal cultural heritage? Again, it's looking at, okay, if there is, who do I need to contact? And that's when you have to look for your local Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Services. And if there is and they have conducted a survey, it's referring to that survey. It's also contacting them to confirm the status of Aboriginal Cultural Heritage. It can also be contacting the Department of Lands, Planning and Heritage to get further information about it. If there is no local Aboriginal Cultural Heritage services, then it's a case of contacting local knowledge holders, local native title holders that are in the area. And that information is meant to be included on the directory. And once you've done that, then it's about consulting with them, engaging with them to determine whether your activity is going to cause harm to Aboriginal cultural heritage and the extent of that harm, whether it's going to be material or it's going to be serious harm. And then it's about developing a plan. So if they're allowing you to undertake this activity, then it's developing a plan so that you reduce the risk to any Aboriginal cultural heritage that's already there, or that is, in the process of being, discovered and registered on the register. If you are undertaking a Tier 3 activity, you've looked on the directory, you can't find any Aboriginal cultural heritage, you've looked through surveys, you contacted your local Aboriginal cultural heritage services, again, no results, then you need to undertake an investigation in accordance with the guidelines that have been released to determine whether there is Aboriginal cultural heritage on your property, and that will involve an investigation with the local Aboriginal cultural heritage services. So a Tier 3 activity, because it's classed as causing greater ground disturbance than a Tier 2, requires a lot more involvement from local knowledge holders and your local Aboriginal cultural heritage services. So they really need to be consulted when you're undertaking these sorts of activities, because they're essentially going to be undertaking investigations and surveys to determine whether your activity will cause harm to Aboriginal cultural heritage. Now, very complicated, and I understand that it's a lot to get your head around, and so there is a lot of information about the due diligence process on the Department of Land's website. They have developed flowcharts to help you understand what the next steps are when you are doing a directory search and whether it comes back with a result that says there's Aboriginal cultural heritage. Obviously, we're here to help if you have questions and assistance, but it is a new process, and so guidelines have been developed to help assist us determine, what the process is, sort of the time frames, and so forth. But yeah, if you have questions, please direct them to us, because it's a new, like I said, it's new legislation. It's a sort of a new procedure that's been introduced. The previous legislation didn't have, an assessment process like this, and an assessment process that's this detailed. So please reach out if you do have questions. Thank you.